Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. Today we are going to continue taking a look at the differences between the Textus Receptus and the Byzantine Text. We are just about through Matthew, and today we're going to take a look at Matthew chapter 13 all the way to chapter 23. There's a couple interesting ones here to take a look at, so come on over with me to the spreadsheet and let's see what's going on here. All right, so as you can see, just kind of scrolling through these really quickly. I know some of you watching on your phones might think that's a little too small. But you should at least see that I've got a couple here highlighted yellow, just some interesting things to talk about. If you've been watching any of the videos in the series, you know that a red one means that there is what I've called a substantive difference in meaning. So let's start here in Matthew 15, verse 32. The difference is imere versus imeras, and that's a difference between the grammatical case. So Matthew 15 verse 32 for context reads, "Then Jesus called his disciples unto him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in the way." And of course, this is when Jesus fed the 5,000 or 4,000. I can't remember exactly. But you can see that the crowd has followed him for 3 days. And that's the question, 3 days. Now, this isn't a translatable difference, so regardless of which translation you're going to use or which text you're going to use, you're still going to translate it 3 days, but the question is grammatical case, right? Is this a nominative plural, okay, nominative plural, or is it an accusative plural? Now, this is interesting only because it gives us an insight into why this kind of variant possibly happened. So now if we take a look at verse 1532 in the Greek text, this is where the interesting variant lies, right? So imeras, that's the accusative plural. This is the Textus Receptus. And we have there the nominative plural in the notes. So the Textus Receptus already has this in Logos. By the way, I was skeptical of Logos, but then I was offered an opportunity to use it as a significantly discounted rate. So I decided to take the plunge and give it a shot. And I've actually found Logos tend to be extremely helpful in these sorts of comparisons. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out just because of the discount I got there. So I've actually found it to be very useful. So I mean, you can see that as a plug if you want, but I think it was a great choice. Anyway, so in this passage here, we have imere, which is the variant that we're talking about. But it's this word here, tris, which is interesting. It's not interesting because it's a textual variant. This word is actually settled, tris. But the interesting part is that grammatically, this word is ambiguous, and this is just the word 3. So when we put imeras tris or imere tris, we're really saying 3 days. So the grammatical ambiguity is that the word tris doesn't change forms for the accusative plural or the nominative plural. They both look the same. So you can imagine that when you're a scribe copying down it and you see the word tris, you're either going to go to imeras because it's accusative plural, which matches the case of tris, or you're going to go nominative plural because it also matches the case of tris. So you can see how that sort of ambiguity looks to be potentially the cause of this variant, or at the very least supports either variant. I just thought that was rather interesting, kind of why I wanted to share this one. Now, the other interesting aspect of this variant here is that this is clearly in the Scrivener's text anyway, the accusative of time. And so what that means, right, for those who don't really do anything with Greek, is that the accusative of time is specifically answering the question, how long? And of course, in this instance, the crowd followed Jesus for 3 days. That's how long. If it were another case, like a dative of time, for example, it would specify when as opposed to how long. So when did the crowd follow? Well, the crowd followed him on the 3rd day, but of course, this is not what the text is saying. So the interesting thing here is that the variant makes the accusative a nominative, a nominative. And if you know anything about Greek grammar or anything like that, there isn't really a specified usage for a nominative of time. So this nominative of time usage is very rare, according to Wallace in his book, and he writes this as a definition for the nominative. Let me just read it. We're going to do a little bit of reading here. It says, "Very rarely in the New Testament, the nominative case is used rather than another case to indicate the measurement of time." Okay, we're talking about the use of extent of time, right? So in this case, the extent of 3 days the crowd followed Jesus. The data are insufficient to tell which oblique case the nominative normally is substituting for. So which case is it referencing? Is it the extent of time, like the accusative? Is it a specific point in time, like the dative case, or kind of time, like the genitive case? It doesn't. There seems to be a little bit of uncertainty. So with that uncertainty, he notes in the grammar that some have argued that it is the rough equivalent of an accusative time, so very similar. But the way it's worded in here doesn't seem like he's entirely convinced. But he ends up concluding at the end of the paragraph that each instance needs to be determined by its own context. So even if it is a nominative of time, we're going to use the context to determine that we're talking about an extent of time. The crowd followed Jesus for 3 days. So whether it's accusative or nominative isn't really going to make a difference in the meaning of the text. We're not going to translate it differently. And if you're going through the text with a Greek mind, you're probably not going to see any real difference in that either. Anyway, let's move on. I just found that interesting and thought you guys might find that interesting as well. I mean, we could make a determination here on which one we think is the original reading. But given that the difference is so null, it really doesn't matter. And I'm going to invoke the content equivalence clause, and you'll have to see Brian Ross's stuff for that. It's equivalent in content. Okay, another variant here that's a little bit interesting is this one here in Matthew chapter 18, verse 4. Not because it makes any real difference, but because this one seems to be a bit of a trend in some of the stuff that I'm looking at. So Matthew 18, verse 4, it just says, "Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So the question we have here is the tense and the mood of the verse tapinosi, humble himself. Is it a future indicative or is it an aorist subjunctive? Now, this is the interesting thing, is that when you take this word, let me pull this up in the Greek text here. This is our verse, and the first thing you're going to notice here is this in the TR, hostis. Hostis. It's the indefinite pronoun. And that's the same in the other passages here, like it's uncontested. So we have an indefinite pronoun, and then we have our verb, whether it's the aorist subjunctive or whether it's the future indicative. Now, it's important to note that there is an indefinite pronoun there, because it seems that when the indefinite pronoun is used, either of these constructions essentially mean the same thing. Now, I mean, that doesn't really seem all that exciting, but the thing is this is a kind of variant that I've seen happen a number of times already in the book of Matthew. So this is a common thing. So whether they're switching out the subjunctive aorist or the future indicative seems to indicate that they're, very similar in meaning. Perhaps it's something that they're using in a specific time frame in the way they're using language. I don't know, but they both mean the same thing, and they have no real impact on the meaning. So again, not super exciting, not super crazy or anything, but you're beginning to see some of these patterns. So let's come down to Matthew chapter 20, verse 2. And Matthew chapter 20, verse 2 reads this. I'll just read it. "And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard." So Jesus is telling a parable here. But it's not even the content of this passage that this variant is about. It's about the little connective word and. And in the King James Version, we have the word and. Sometimes they will translate it by not putting the word and. Sometimes they will put something like now or whatever it is. But the difference is actually between these two words here. K and then, wow, that's difficult. K and day, or they, the delta epsilon. Now, the difference between these two is very subtle, very, very, very subtle. K is almost always translated and. Sometimes it can have an aversive like but the whole purpose of and is just simply to join words or join clauses. If there's any other semantic meaning there, it just happens to be there. The K just joins clauses. Now, day, on the other hand, it joins clauses, but it does it with a sense of what's called development. Okay. And I have this book here called A Discourse Grammar of the Greek New Testament by Stephen Runge. And I think it's Runge. I don't know how to pronounce that. He gives what I think is the best defining attribute of the word day. And let me just read it here because you'll get it. He says, "The use of day represents the writer's choice to explicitly signal that what follows is a new, distinct development in the story or argument based on how the writer conceived it. So basically what he's doing is there's a little a mental pause here before moving on to the next section, whereas and joins it to the previous section. Now, de is oftentimes not translated. You could even sometimes translate it as just simply putting a paragraph indent in there, right? It almost signals a new paragraph, but not always, but oftentimes it does. It's a really nuanced difference between de and ke. And I heard it best said once by someone, I can't remember who or from where. I don't know where, from who. So I'm going to give you this totally anonymous wisdom. And his suggestion was that de is often felt and not translated. And yeah, I know that sounds subjective. But anyway, there's just a knack to it. And again, the Greek mind would get it much better than us English people. That was just, again, another interesting variant. It's not going to make any difference. It's not even really going to be translated. So let's move on. Matthew chapter 21, verse 3, apostelli versus apostelli. So to give you some context again, let's come over to Matthew chapter 21, verse 3. And if any man say aught unto you, ye shall say, the Lord hath need of them, and straightway he will send them. I think he's talking about the donkeys here now. If you remember, we were talking about that in the last video because there was an interesting TR variant that I wanted to track down there. So if you haven't seen that, go take a look at it. After you're done watching this video. So the question here is the end of that verse when he says, and he will send them. And he will send them, right? That's a future tense verb. So apostelli with the two lambdas, okay, that is a present tense. And then apostelli with the single lambda is a future tense verb. Now, the question is when it says the Lord hath need of them and straightway he will send them, right? The whole idea is that's going to happen in the future. But there seems to be a little bit more of a sort of I don't even know, like it's an indicative verb, but there's an idea of something has to happen first in order for him to send them, right? But anyway, is that a future verb or is that a present verb? So I took a look again in my grammar with Wallace, and Wallace seems to suggest that there are occasions where a present tense verb, so apostelli, can often function with a futuristic sense. And so this is the argumentation here, is that if this is as the RP text has said it, it's going to be functioning in a futuristic sense. And so we would translate this as a future tense verb anyway. So the translation doesn't change. But I want to open up to a potential idea that I thought of while looking at this, is that if that's a present tense verb, this seems to be almost like the opposite of a historical present, right? Where it uses a present tense verb in order to explain something in the past to give it a little bit more vividness. I'm almost wondering if there's a case here where maybe the present tense is being used for a future event to give an idea of the certainty of that happening when that condition takes place, right? So Jesus, if he were to be using the present tense here, perhaps he's saying that it's absolutely certain that if you say the Lord has need of it, he will give you the donkeys. Anyway, again, which reading are we going to select? I'm probably inclined to say the RP text. This isn't something that you're going to see translatable. It's not a translatable difference. And obviously, it's not going to substantively change the way we read or understand the text. So let's move on. In Matthew chapter 21, verse 22, I'll read this out here. And he writes, and it says, and all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive. So the question here is, whatsoever ye shall ask. In the RP text, we have aeon, which is actually the word if, usually used in the sense of if. And then we have in the TR reading just simply on. And on is a particle in Greek that isn't really translatable. It's just kind of one of those weird words. We don't really have anything like it, but it makes something contingent upon something else. That was the best definition I found. And it took me a little while to wrap around in my own head how this word is used, but you're typically going to see it with a subjunctive verb only because it's referring to something that's not entirely certain. It's not a statement of fact or anything like that. In this specific passage, both words are going to be translated the same way. Whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive it. It's contingent upon believing. Hence why on could work there. But aeon also works on this idea of contingency as well. There seems to be a bit of overlap in meaning between aeon and on. And if you go to BDAG, that big red lexicon that costs you like $300, I know it's crazy. It also makes reference to on and aeon functioning in a very similar capacity in certain statements. So again, that's what we're seeing here. This is functioning in a similar capacity. So whether we have the RP text as aeon or the TR as on, they still mean the same thing. This is turning out to be a much longer video than I had anticipated. So I think we're going to stop there. And we're going to come back. I want to come back to chapter 23 and take a look at Matthew chapter 23, verse 25, because it's got an interesting variant there, which does, I think, make a substantive change. And we'll take a look at that in the next video. If you like the content that you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, give me a like below, and hit that subscribe button. It lets the YouTube algorithm know that this content is good and, is good to share to everybody else. So please do that. Anyway, I hope you found this content useful. And until next time, brothers and sisters, we'll see you around.